All right, so today we're diving into a really fascinating and honestly pretty radical theory from our source material. We're going to re-examine one of Europe's most famous dynasties, the Carolingians, but through a totally unexpected lens, the Bible.
And it all boils down to this one question. When we look at the story of these powerful kings, are we just seeing a bunch of weird coincidences? Or are we looking at a history that was deliberately copied from a much, much older blueprint?
Okay, so to get into this, we have to start with something that's not up for debate at all. It's a well-known historical fact about the great Emperor Charlemagne and who he looked up to.
You see, it's a famous fact that Charlemagne, the biggest name of the Carolingian dynasty, was a huge admirer of King David from ancient Israel. He actually asked the people in his court to call him the new David. For a long time, historians just saw this as, good branding.
But here's where the theory we're looking at today takes a huge leap. It asks, what if this was way more than just a nickname? What if it was a signal that the entire story of his dynasty was being intentionally structured to perfectly mirror the story of Israel's first kings?
All right, let's really dig into the evidence here, because the core of this whole argument is this incredible parallel between two sets of three kings separated by almost 2,000 years of history.
So on the left, you've got the first three kings of ancient Israel, Saul, David, and Solomon. On the right, the first three major Carolingian rulers, Pippin, Charlemagne, and Louis the Pious. Now, the theory claims these aren't just two random lists of kings. No, they are the exact same story, just told centuries apart. So how does this work? Well, let's start with king number one. In the Bible, King Saul's legitimacy comes from being anointed by the prophet Samuel, right? The highest religious figure around. Now fast forward a couple thousand years, Pippin becomes the first Carolingian king, and how does he seal the deal? By being anointed by the Pope. It's the same move. Next up, king number two, the empire builders. King David is famous as the warrior king who expanded Israel's borders through conquest. And Charlemagne? Well, his story's almost a carbon copy, a legendary warrior king who built a massive empire through conquest.
And that brings us to the third king in the pattern. After the warrior, you get the peacemaker, the builder. Solomon's reign was all about wisdom, law, and consolidating the empire he inherited. And Louis the Pious, he does the exact same thing. He steps back from his dad's wars and focuses on internal stuff, religion, law, bringing the empire together.
But here's the kicker, the part that's really hard to ignore. The parallel follows through right to the very end. After Solomon dies, his kingdom splits in two, permanently. And what happens after Louis the Pious dies? You guessed it. His sons divide the empire, and it never gets put back together. The story arc is identical from start to finish. So you might think, okay, that's a pretty wild parallel with the kings. But it doesn't stop there. The source we're looking at argues this pattern shows up in other places too, like in big building projects and even how people talked about history.
Think about King Solomon. What's he most famous for building? The first temple in Jerusalem. And the Bible tells us it took him 7 years to build it.
Okay, now check this out, because this is where it gets really specific. Charlemagne's own biographer, the guy writing his official story, says flat out that Charlemagne built his famous chapel at Aachen using the most wise Solomon as his example. And guess how long it supposedly took?
Yep.
7 years. They're not even hiding the comparison, they're shouting it from the rooftops.
And this habit of echoing the Bible just keeps popping up even hundreds of years down the line. Back in the 6th century BC, the Jewish elite were exiled in what's known as the Babylonian captivity. So in the 14th century AD, when the popes packed up and moved from Rome to Avignon, what did everyone start calling that period? The Babylonian captivity of the papacy. They literally grabbed the name right out of the Old Testament.
So, what are we supposed to make of all this? This is where the source material puts all the pieces on the table and asks a really provocative question. Are we looking at a series of amazing coincidences, or was this history made to look this way?
And this leads us to this really important idea, a German term called Geschichtskonstruktion. It basically means historical construction. The idea is that history, especially back then, wasn't just about writing down what happened. It was about actively building a narrative, shaping a story to serve a purpose.
Now, you might be thinking, come on, could they really pull off something that big? Fabricating a whole dynastic story? Well, the source argues that you have to remember what this era was like. It was the golden age of forgery.
I mean, historians now agree that something like 2/3 of all documents from the era right before Charlemagne are fakes, and during Charlemagne's time, nearly half. It was totally normal to create documents to prove you owned land or had a royal title.
And maybe the most convincing piece of evidence that this was a known strategy is that the Carolingians weren't the only ones to do it. The source points out that the official history of the Ethiopian dynasty, founded way later in 1270, uses the exact same three-king blueprint. It starts with their Saul, moves to their David, and ends with a king literally named Solomon I. It's like this was a well-known playbook for any new kingdom that wanted to claim it had God's blessing.
Okay, so when you put it all together, the kings, the 7-year temple, the forgeries, the fact that other kingdoms did it too, it all pushes us toward one last really big question. A question about what history even is. This idea of Geschichtskonstruktion really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? Is history just a clean record of what actually happened? Or is it a story, a narrative that's been shaped by authors who had a very clear goal in mind, to build legitimacy, to unite a people, to create an empire that reflected a divine plan? The evidence from the source is on the table, and the question it leaves us with is, if history is a story, who's holding the pen?